Hello, welcome everyone. As you're joining, welcome to our conversation today. We're getting started here shortly. I'm Kristen Daly here in the Linksbridge offices with our author, Bob Mcpherson. We'll wait just one more minute as people are joining. Let me tell you a little bit about the technology and I'll repeat it too. We're going to be taking some questions from the audience. So please think about some questions that you might have for Bob and write them in the chat. Type them in the chat in your Zoom. Well, let's get started. We have so much to cover today and I want to make sure we get all the content in. Again, I'm Kristen Daly. I'm the Executive Director of Global Washington, one of your co-hosts here today. And if you don't know, Global Washington is a network of organizations that have a presence in Washington State and do work to improve lives in low and middle income countries. I am so thrilled to co-host this event with Linksbridge. And there's just 5 of us here in the Linksbridge offices. So very excited to have this hybrid event to have you all watch online as well. I was very excited to have this event with Bob because when I heard about his book, he is talking about the issues that are so important to the Global Washington community in particular. His book that he'll talk about today, he talks in particular about Afghanistan, about the mental health and the toll that humanitarian work has on staff for global development organizations. And he really has an eye to the future of global development. So these topics are both timeless and timely for today. So I'm thrilled to be here with Bob as well. And I wanted to thank George and Jane and Robin here at Linksbridge for bringing this topic to you all. And again, if you didn't hear as you first logged on, we're going to be taking some questions from the audience. Please think about some questions and type them in the chat. The format today will have a conversation with Bob and George Durham from Linksbridge will be leading that conversation. And again, we'll be touching on different topics and weaving in questions from the audience throughout. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to introduce Bob.
Thanks, Kristen. So Bob Mcpherson has had a long and varied career. First as United States Marine Colonel, service in Vietnam, Gulf War I and Somalia, next with the International Humanitarian Organization, CARE, next with his own Constantois group. This book is, of course, very much his story, but it also serves to ask what we really mean by humanitarianism. How has humanitarianism changed over the last decades? And most importantly, how does humanitarianism need to change in order to meet the coming challenges, of which no doubt there will be many. So for those in the room and particularly online, I pass over to Bob Macpherson.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. And particularly thank you to Jane Barry for encouraging me from the very beginning to write this book. So I appreciate that. Those 3 topics or subject heads, I think we could spend probably a semester trying to run through them, but let me give you the best shot I can in an hour, because they really, all 3 of them are not even casually pertinent at this time. Afghanistan, the first time I stepped into Afghanistan was in 1999 as a member of CARE, and I have to say it was from 99 to 2001, or at 96 to 2001. The Taliban controlled the country. You can imagine my thoughts when I walked into Afghanistan as a former US Marine with an American passport. I couldn't help but wonder how that was going to work. And actually it worked a lot better than I thought. And I had numerous trips to Afghanistan until I got injured there in 2016. So what I'm going to try to do is just to pull an excerpt from the book. And I hope this excerpt will cover many of the topics we just discussed, but also give you an insight in 2 or 3 minutes as to what those things that really impacted me during those many visits out there. One of the schools was a small building in an adjacent village. There were approximately 20 girls and young women who arrived each day shortly after dawn and attended reading, writing, and geography classes. At 11, the students engaged in play or sports. At noon, they were served a meal and rested for a short period. Afterward, they adjourned to weaving rooms. Each of the young women was also learning a skill that would assist her family. I asked Najan, who was my companion, why the local Taliban allowed this type of schooling. He told me the further we journeyed from Kabul, the more liberal the attitudes of the Taliban leaders towards women and girls. With a smile, he added, it helps that some of the young women in this school are also their daughters. Throughout the remainder of the trip, I noticed most of the women in the rural areas routinely walked and worked with only a head covering. I seldom saw women in burqas. As Najan and I continued to Patkia and host, we visited projects with every form of irrigation. Najan initiated work involving small dams, reservoirs, spillways, culverts, irrigation conduits, small bridges, and siphon tubes. With each project, he included the means to protect the environment from erosion. There were walls, stones, terracing, and other methods to preserve the habitat. I was impressed with the number of reservoirs being built around small villages. These were isolated hamlets amid an arid desert. All of the lands were surrounded by a range of mountains with peaks well over 12,000 feet. Fields of snow and ice capped each crest. The goal was to move the water from the melting snow into the reservoirs for irrigation and daily use by the people in the communities. The basins were dug in groves of eucalyptus trees, which grow to an enormous height, providing the pools with shade. On a hot afternoon, Najan and I were with several engineers who had just completed a reservoir in the Grozny province. The basin was approximately 6 by 8 meters wide and 1 meter deep. As we walked around the basin, I kneeled and put my hand in the water. It was frigid. Najan said, it would be a good day for a swim. I laughed. A moment later, I felt a small push and fell into the pool. It was a severe shock, but my body adjusted. Around me, my Afghan colleagues were laughing like a group of school children. I hooted and walked to the edge of the reservoir, extending my hand for Najan to help me out of the water. When I had a firm grip, I fell back into the basin and pulled him with me. When he came to the surface, he started laughing until he had tears in his eyes. We scrambled out of the pool, and my companions removed their outer robes to the clothing they wore underneath. We spent the next half hour splashing, laughing, and playing like we were in summer camp. In those moments of abandonment, we let go of our pretenses, cultural restrictions, and biases. We became one. We were not Afghans, Americans, Christians, or Muslims. We were just a group of people enjoying one another's company and having fun. Najan, when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, the international staff left and set up, if you will, their administrative shops in Pakistan. And Najan served as the country director of the nation, or of CARE's work in the nation. And what was unique to me is how, in that complexity of that situation, we had to go right to the core of who could really operate in that environment safely and continue with the aid that we had to provide. And here's a slight offset to that. In many of the places I went, and at that time I was still naive towards I'd been at it a while, but was naive towards how this system really worked. Well, within the US government, as many of you know, there's the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. So in the midst of the Taliban in Afghanistan at that time, and I say this to the credit of America, they were still channeling aid to the people of Afghanistan through the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. Well, consider this. How would that have gone over if I were administrating that aid compared to a person who they respected? Najan had been a fighter in the Mujahideen against the Soviets during their invasion. So he had a degree of respect. He was and is just a magnificent leader, but he was able to integrate these systems with the Taliban. And one more thing to add to that is that in the midst of that regime, he had 3 of his sub-offices around the country who were run by women. The Taliban allowed that to happen. Now, there was leverage, certainly. They needed the assets that he was directing. But again, it was that local leadership at the country level with Najan that made that happen. Are there any questions that we want to continue with at this point, or would you like me just to continue on?
I think, well, we'd love to continue to hear from you. I'm sure there are questions about Afghanistan, and we'll keep an eye on the chat. I'd be
Okay.
curious to know, from your perspective, I mean, one of the themes in the book, as Kristen alludes to, is this message of hope. And I'd be curious to hear your reflections on, especially in the current environment with the United States tumultuous withdrawal, with the Taliban now ascending to power again. Where do you see moments of hope in Afghanistan at present?
Is there a soapbox that you could pull up? Because believe me, I could go on with this one forever. Look, I have one. There's a lot of obviously things that I respect and have hopes for in Afghanistan. But the one thing I've seen since 1999 through the 30th of August are the women. The women. The women, even in the midst of the Taliban in those days, I saw women go into the streets in places and protest when the Taliban would shut down a school in Kabul. Unheard of. Unheard of. Now, they paid a price. I've also seen women beaten in the streets in that town, particularly in Kabul. But my feeling is that the women of that country have come far too far to go back, if I say euphemistically, back into the burqa. I'm not saying that's not going to happen for a period, but I think you have a population in Afghanistan that their rights are nothing like we enjoy in the West, but they have come remarkably far. And another NGO that I sat on the board of directors was generally a legal NGO. And they facilitated women, girls, going through school, but also getting their law degrees. In fact, here's just a throwaway. I saw the other day. So I'm not a rocket science. I looked at this and it jumped out at me. Before the Taliban took over again, there were more women representatives in their parliament as there are in the Congress of the United States of America. That says a lot. The women in many ways also administered, there were men involved, but when it came down to civil law in Afghanistan, that became almost a majority women environment with judges and lawyers, things like that. Did that answer it?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. There was a phrase you used early in the book. You kind of talk about the examples of these stewards of humanity, as you refer to them, walking into horrific situations armed with a willingness to confront rather than retreat from justice. And I think, just even in the news today, you're seeing many of these women take to the streets to do much of this, as you're suggesting.
Yeah, and you didn't set me up for that. With the first person I met who I saw do that is sitting at this table with women's rights in Bosnia, in Russia, and in Rwanda, and that was Jane. So yeah.
Thank you. And Bob, of course, is referring to my dear colleague, Jane Barry, who has been with Linksbridge and its partner Sassanat for many years. And she and Bob have known one another. Jane was our connection to have Bob kind of participate in this, and we'll have I think a moment to hear from Jane this hour as well. One question that's coming from Alex, he suggests that it's probably the average American may not actually know that much about Afghanistan, and he wondered what, based on your experience, what's something that you wish more people knew or understood about Afghanistan, Afghans, and maybe something we as citizens of this country ought to be keeping in mind?
It's we have a tendency in our media to portray Afghans as these very stern, particularly men and women, but more so than men. What do we see? We see full beards, and we see gruff looks, and I have to tell you, I'm not a person who is given to laughter a lot. Doesn't mean I'm overly serious. I just am not someone who will start laughing till tears come out of my eyes. The Afghans that I have been around could put me on my knees laughing with their descriptions of things and people. Their humor is across the board. The other thing is, and I think this has been demonstrated by history, once an Afghan is your friend, you have a friend for life, even when you don't deserve it. Trust me, I know this from my own personal experience, even when I didn't deserve that friendship. Once they had given themselves to say, you are my friend, it's even deeper than that. They take a responsibility for you. Just obviously, I have a lot of affection for Afghans, but they are caring, regardless of what we're seeing now. And obviously, I'm not speaking about the Taliban, but I'm speaking about the people just like you and me, who care about their kids, who want to provide education for them, who want to take care of them, who want to see them progress. They're just like us, maybe even with a little more humor.
Thank you. No other questions from the audience at the moment. Any other observations you'd like to share on your experience in Afghanistan? And I think
The one is that I was impressed for the first time in my life with how little control, how few men in this case could gain control of a nation. When you think about America, think about it. I can say this as a former member of the military. We have millions of men and women under arms, okay? In Afghanistan, somebody can call me out on this. I don't know, I'm really reaching for this one. But I'm gonna bet that there were probably less than 20,000, less than 10,000 Afghan Taliban running around. But they gained control of this nation. And they did it. They certainly did it through the end of a gun, the end of a weapon. But that to me was one of the most startling things, with how few I actually ran into. And there were two sides to this. I met some Taliban who scared me to death. I mean, really. I thought, I walked into the Minister of State Security one time, and I remember thinking, okay, all right, Bobby, it's man up time. On the other hand, yeah, it's going to be a tough road, I think. And I think the only way, and I'm pulling this out a bit, is this group of Taliban are not their fathers, and they know they need international assistance to stay afloat. And that's incumbent on us to make sure that for that assistance, they live up to the standards of rights and humanitarianism, and much of which we take for granted.
Thank you. If you're willing, I'd be interested to turn a little bit toward issues of challenges surrounding mental health. The book, Stewards of Humanity, doesn't shy away from tackling and addressing some of the very real and very difficult mental health impacts and challenges that aid workers, humanitarian workers face, from witnessing trauma to all sorts of things. I'm curious, what advice would you give others, listeners, individuals, organizations in supporting staff and supporting loved ones, friends, families, colleagues in their own lives? How do we recognize and appropriately better treat the mental health of these stewards, as you say, who are doing so much?
You hear the scraping again, because man, that's soapbox. That's definitely soapbox number 2. Look, I suffer from complex PTSD. In fact, if you could swing the cameras around, you see a big yellow lab over there, who's my service dog, who's all actually right now alerting on the emotion. He hears my voice. Here's the key. When I finally reached the point of knowing that I needed to do something about that, we don't need to get into how or why. Fortunately, it wasn't overly dramatic. I had a place to turn. I went to the VA, and because many of you don't know this, but when you retire from the military, you still are allowed to use all of their facilities for hospitals and things, just like you're still on active duty. So the VA was not something I was accustomed to. If I had a problem, I went to a naval hospital someplace. But the VA was where I'd heard a lot about their assistance with PTSD. So I entered that structure. It was one of the smartest things I've ever done. But see, I had a place to go. And the minute I walked in there, literally the minute I walked in there, they embraced me because of the magic words and I didn't know they were the magic words. I just had walked in and said, geez, I think I'd like to talk to somebody. And boom, this whole system fell open for me. Then in writing the book, I realized one person I write about who died by suicide, but doesn't that uncover all these other things? And then I began to think about the number of people I knew who had died, NGO colleagues who had died by suicide. But then it expands. You begin to think, well, wait a minute, how many divorces? How many people do I know with substance abuse? And this is not just some talk. These are people I knew. And I wasn't going to broadcast in a book, but I thought, my God, where do they go? So to fast forward, in 1999, the humanitarian community realized it had to do something about staff safety and security. So AFTA actually, again, funded like $2 million to bring this all together and start taking care and working towards staff safety and security. It was a game changer. And what the real game changer was when the presidents and CEOs of the 7 largest humanitarian organizations on the planet showed up in Washington, D.C., and sat down and decided to do something about this. My friends, that's what we need to do about staff mental health in the humanitarian community. Because it's there, people know the right words, they know the buzzwords, they know that they can say, well, we have these things in place. Well, those things being in place are important, necessary, but until it's inculcated into the staffing and the leadership of those organizations, it's still going to be, a lot of it will be talk. And the one classic example I have about this, not mentioning names, is an organization had set up an entire staff wellness center group. And it was dealing with exactly this issue. When the budget cuts came, I don't need to finish the story. So yes, it's out there, and not to push it, this is the last thing until Jane throws up, it's time to stop talking. But the last thing about this is that, think about it this way. Think about a colleague you have she's 28 years old, and she has been around a bit. She has got out of university and maybe she has an MPH. And she joins an organization as a consultant to go to a complex environment. She drops into that environment, spends, you name it in this day and age, just throw a dart at the map. You'll find a complex environment that's dangerous. So she spends 6 months there. Her contract's over, she goes home, and that's it. There's no follow-up. There's nothing to do. We have no idea what happened. So those are the things we have to overcome. And it's doable. It's just, we need as a community to say, you know, we took on this staff safety and security, and think about it. Staff safety and security, the link to mental health, it's one and the same, isn't it? Rather than getting a bullet pumped into you, you come down with, it's tough to say this about yourself. You come down with a mental illness. And trust me, that can be more devastating than having a hole drilled through you.
Are there any examples of organizations you think that are doing this well that perhaps we learn from, or more along the same lines, you know, any practical advice for, you know, those who may be listening?
Here it comes.
You know, for individuals who have in their own spheres of influence people who may need help, how can they help them find the resources they need?
Look, in 2011, there was a document that's 60 or 80 pages, and many of the listeners may have heard of this. And the document was written by some people from Great Britain, but it's called Duty of Care, Can You Get Sued? And when I first saw that title, I was not enamored with it. I thought that's just, I was not enamored with it till I sat down and read the document. And in that document, it lays out a number of things that organizations are responsible for doing, and included in that are conditions to assist with mental health. You can start there, but I got to give 2 other organizations credit to go back to trying to answer your question. There's the Headington Institute and there's Conterra. Headington is overseas, pardon me, California. Okay, I have to be careful with that one, but Conterra is in Washington, D.C. And just because of locale, I know Conterra better than Headington. But if you're interested in what to look at, the questions to ask, and what an organization should be doing, both those websites, I know as a fact, lay out exactly what should be going on in the humanitarian community.
Good. Thank you. Anything you want to share from the book in this vein?
In
On
this
the mental
vein,
health vein, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And here's the bottom line to it all, and you already know it. It is, you know when you need help. You know when it's gotten too far. And all those reasons that you have to wrestle with. And a lot of them have to do with ego. A lot of them have to do with your job. I recounted to Robin, I think one time, because we both had a military background. I had a top secret special category intelligence clearance. You know what? I'm not sure what would have happened to me had I walked in and said, I think I have a problem. Or if I were diagnosed with complex PTSD. Maybe somebody out there knows, but I'm not sure what would have happened to that clearance. Isn't it the same thing in your job? One thing about NGOs or humanitarian workers is they, in some fashion, love what they do. More so than most organizations I've ever been around. And I've been around, I can say in the Marine Corps, those Marines step up. But even more so than Marines, these people cared. And they don't want to put that job in jeopardy. And that's where it comes to a collaborative effort between the organization assuring that person that we're going to help you out and you're not going to pay a price professionally for it. That's the key. But for the individual, all I can tell you is what people have told me and what I've experienced. I was lost. Without too much drama, I was worse than lost. I was dangerous. And just by going and getting some assistance changed my life. It put me here. I would have not been able to sit down in front of a blinking blue light. But I would not have been able to do that without going through it. And it's there. It was easier for me, and I'll tell you up front, with the VA than it probably is going to be for you. But it's worth doing. You don't want to end up isolated, angry, and just beside yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I'd be curious, you mentioned your Marine service, and you talk about this in the book, that, you know, from both your service in the Marine Corps as well as on the humanitarian side, you see much of the same kind of compassion and desire to serve and to help others. I'd just be curious to hear some of your reflections on that.
You can imagine when I joined the humanitarian community, I used to make a joke. It wasn't funny to me. And let me backstep one more. This is, I believe, a problem in the United States. It's not a problem that I've seen in Europe. But the joke I made was that when, for most of my colleagues, age-wise, when I enlisted or joined the Marine Corps, most of my colleagues in the humanitarian community of my age joined the Peace Corps. Let me tell you, from the 60s, those were two extremely different worlds.
Different universes.
Yeah, and I listen, for our own part who went to Vietnam, most of us, that was not our choice by any way, shape, or form. But I think that what I have said to colleagues in the past is, make no mistake, the young woman or man who enlists or is commissioned in the armed forces of the United States believes that the hat they're putting on is just as white as the hat that you're wearing. They truly believe it's not about going out there and all the things the media portrays about the military. And man, that came home to me in Somalia, was when those troops landed in Somalia, they were not there to make war. No matter how that ended up, they were there to assist people. And even with the respect of taking a step back and saying, you know what? We have these assets. We have all these things in the military, but you're the experts. So you, within the humanitarian community and the UN and the ICRC, you point the way. We're going to follow it through, but you point the way. So I think that, yeah, that's a mistake that people make that I felt, yeah, I will admit it may have been the only thing I felt I had to overcome. And that bothered me at times. I had led Marines in combat and I had sent them home in body bags. And I had to overcome that. I did not appreciate that slight stigma that went along with that. But it's gotten a lot better, and I'm not trying to make a happy face on it. Trust me, over 30 years, it's gotten a lot better.
Two questions that have come in. One, Alex asks, what traits from your Marine Corps service actually were really important that you learned there to then translated into your NGO and your humanitarian work later on? And then Donnie asks, you mentioned the media and maybe their portrayal of the military in Somalia, but what about humanitarian workers and how the media represent and talk about humanitarian workers and humanitarian work broadly? Any reflections there?
Yeah. Okay, let me go to the first one. Is Alex?
Yeah.
Alex, I think what translated two things. One was just, and look, I was in infantry. I started out as a PFC and they sent me to college, so I ended up as an infantry officer. So the planning, the ability to pull together the logistics, the operations. I see Robin kind of nodding his head, I think, in that there was everything. I used to think that everything was the same until the last event. In other words, we're making war. Vice, we were doing humanitarian work. But laying it out and trying to plan for all the things to pull that mission together was something that I could tell you, I can speak for the Marines. They started you on the first day you were a Marine in boot camp in their own subtle way of starting that. I think the second thing is, and I've always been a wee bit gun shy of saying this because I feel like it's a little bit of look at me, but I do say that, again, from that very first day of my introduction into the Marine Corps, they wanted to train leaders. And we used to understand, and I believe this is the truth. I believe in a lot of other armed forces outside of NATO, that they have these very rigid structures of rank. So certainly there was a difference between a lance corporal and a colonel. But what they wanted to do was to train the youngest enlisted person so that if the captains, the lieutenants, the sergeants, the gunner are all gone for some reason, there's still someone who's trained with the leadership to say, okay, I've been waiting to do this all the time anyhow, so I'm in charge, let's go get it done. So I believe that training helped me a lot. But incumbent with that, and I'm glad I said but, was learning very early on the difference between persuasive leadership and authoritarian leadership. Somebody's going to follow me in the armed forces because of what I have on my collar and what I have on my sleeve, okay? That is, if you will, they will respect that rank. But to do the job and bring people back the way you want, in one piece and alive, it takes the persuasive leadership where women and men are going to follow you rather than feeling that they're being driven. How does the media portray humanitarian workers? That's really interesting. It's interesting because I've never thought of it, which makes it even more interesting. Okay. All right, here we go. I think it can be summed up in something. I love to write, so I'm just going to say something I wrote recently, and I entitled it Humanitarian Aid Workers, the Forgotten First Responders. And the gist of the article I wrote is, in this day and age, we pay an awful lot of respect, rightfully so, to our first responders who are working in the front lines with COVID, to our military always, since about the beginning in this millennium. The police, the firemen, we have these first responders, right? And we know who they are, and we do. We say thank you to them. Well, there are 450,000, give or take, professional humanitarian workers around the planet. Do you ever hear about them? And trust me, they're not doing well, some may be, but not many. They're not doing none are doing humanitarian work in Ireland, okay? I mean, they're in really desperate places, doing desperate things. And again, look, I don't want to beat this to death by going on too much, but my first realization of being an aid worker was hopping off a helicopter I was able to scramble a ride on from Split in Croatia into Sarajevo, thanks to British naval services. And I hopped off that helicopter, and someplace in the distance, there was no drama to this, no danger, no nothing. It just, in the distance, I heard a mortar round go off. And the helicopter got out of there, as obviously they should. And again, no drama, it was a long way away. But as that plane lifted off, I realized that for the first time since I was 17 years of age, if I got injured, the Marine Corps was not going to blacken the sky with helicopters to come find me. And that's where your aid workers are. I'm not saying they're not completely without structure to support, but nothing like what we're used to, even outside of the military.
Thank you. And it may, maybe we should all be thinking about opportunities to tell more of those stories and make them more familiar.
Yeah, I would like to see the media pay more attention to what these folks do.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'd like to turn next to this kind of question or topic, as Kristen raised, of decolonizing aid, decolonization. This is something I know that, at least in our own organization, we talk about a lot, but the way we go about implementing humanitarian aid around the world has changed dramatically, and even just in the decades that you write about in your book. So I'd be curious to hear your observations on what are some of the big shifts you've observed. Where do you think the field is going, should be going, especially as we think about the influence that expatriates and the kind of just Western institutions play, important though that may be. How do we think about that, or what's a better way to be thinking about how aid should be administered, delivered, et cetera?
Do I have 3 minutes to lead into this with this? Thank you. And that's a great segue into this. Hawa's camp, and who I'm talking about is Dr. Hawa Abdi, and she died on the 5th of August, 2020. And she's a remarkable woman. Hawa's camp of 20,000 people was developed and maintained by Somalis helping one another. And this is when I was in Somalia as a Marine in Restore Hope. As far as I could see, there were small igloo-type shelters constructed from thin scrub branches. There were 2 to 4 shelters in an area, and the space was protected by an interlocking wall of Somali thorn bushes as sharp as any standard concertina wire. The compound was anchored by a large block structure in the center. It was a hospital. Inside, the only light came from the narrow slits at the top of the exterior walls. I learned later this design shielded the patients from gunshots and shrapnel. There were so many people crammed into a limited space, and regardless of the injury, most of them were emaciated. They were being treated for starvation, gunshot, and shrapnel wounds. The victims were of every age. Hawa said the hospital assisted anyone in need. Consequently, a gunman who might raid the camp for food, money, or women one day would be treated the next for wounds suffered in a gunfight. Later, as I reflected on the withdrawal of the US from Somalia and the dead US service members in Mogadishu, I looked at the long scar that snaked down the inside of my left arm. It was a remnant of the gun battle in an alley in Somalia. But Hawa's words were repeated in my memory. And what she said to me was, "No, I mean you will all go home. You do not understand what will happen when you depart. It is not our way to allow you to stay." When I went back to Somalia several years later as a member of CARE, I found her camp frequently suffered incursions from different groups, all of whom promised retaliation because they claimed she was a CIA spy and a puppet of the Americans. She continued in a soft voice, telling me their revenge was far worse than her own death. A group of men kidnapped and killed her only son, claiming he was a spy, an agent of the US government. I turned ashen, and she asked, "What's wrong?" I replied, "I am the catalyst who started your public association with the United States." As I spoke, I forgot my ego, fear, and the shields I hid behind. My answer was beyond an apology. I had to accept accountability. It was me. I brought the Americans to the camp. She looked at me and said, "Robert, you only tried to help. You had nothing to do with this. Inshallah, it is God's will." I tried to accept her absolution, but the guilt is always with me. There are things in life you cannot rectify, no matter how hard you try. I try to pull this together. So George Bush Sr. decided that in his waning days as the president, he wanted to visit Somalia because he had sent us there. And I was called to the headquarters, and they said to me in Somalia, "We'd like to show the president something where the Somalis are helping each other." I said, "Well, that's a no-brainer. We can take him to Somalia's camp. I have to ask her." So I went, and she thought, and she considered it, but she also thought of what the assets that would come from that would help her with the people who she was assisting. And so I brought the president of the United States to Hawa's camp at that time in La Follette in Somalia, outside of Mogadishu. Now let's pull this apart. She had to struggle time and time again because it wasn't out of anger or disregard, but she wouldn't take the money from the international NGOs or the UN because she knew there was always something attached to that. And it's not always a bad thing, but how she used that money, how she assisted her countrymen, were going to be dictated in the sense of, well, you know, we're into maternal health, so that's where we want this funding to go. And, you know, she might be saying, look, I need to keep them all alive beyond just the mothers. So, and that's an example. I'm not even sure it's a good one, But there's always things like that that go along with it. Now, this whole business of where we are, the first time I noticed it was on my way to Bosnia for the very first time with CARE. And I can use their name because they did a great job taking care of this in the near term. So I was this guy going off to the Bosnian war to do good things for CARE. Well, CARE was made up of 11 different national organizations. So it was really the Canadians and the Australians who were, if you will, overseeing CARE's implementation in Bosnia. And CARE USA was funding a lot of money. But when I went into the boardroom to sit down with the senior staff, the most senior staff, I looked around and they all looked like me. They all looked like me. They were men. They were about my age. Listen, I just come from the Marine Corps. I mean, my God, the United States Marine Corps, probably the most male bastion on the planet. But beginning in the mid 80s, they started to work to change that. So for that to startle me, it was quite an environment. But again, to give them credit, they have really gone out of their way to balance that, and they have done. But the next level are national staff. And for a long time, we talked about empowering national staff. That was the verbiage we used. We're going to empower national staff. Well, what did that mean? Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it meant, well, the international staff are going to pull out, think Najan in Afghanistan, and we're going to just implement through national staff. But again, behind every one of those was an admin office still controlling the funding and the rest of those things. So then a couple of them, and I will give credit to CARE and Save the Children, where they have tried to incorporate taking what used to be national offices and having them work with their own entity. It becomes an all national office. Now, I have to hope I'm articulate enough here, because there's a leap, and it's not always on the part of that humanitarian organization. So for decolonization, or if you will, the fulfillment of allowing the future of global development to be completely run by local, in my terminology, humanitarian organizations that aren't a subset of the greater ones. Here are some of the problems you run into. And the biggest is donors. So the donor sits there and says, okay, XYZ NGO, we're going to fund you to do girls' education in, hopefully, in Afghanistan. All right. So they are not going to allow that funding to just be turned over to that local NGO with really no strings attached. In other words, that we haven't got to that point in our donor community, and again, in international NGOs. And this is just the way it works. A lot of that donor funding will come through that organization, and that organization needs to have assets to stay viable. So they take some of that overhead to keep that organization viable, because without it, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Consequently, that funding still tends to run through these other organizations. And that's not bad. I mean, you know, where would we be without a lot of these organizations? But that's the dilemma, is how do we get there? And look, here's the big one. This is the key. We could talk around this all the time, but let's just dig down into the core issue. The core issue is trust. It's trust. And it's the sense of, okay, there's always, as we used to say in the Marines, there's always 10%. Fortunately, there's 10% on one side who are just exceptional beyond belief, but there's the other 10%. And that's who we remember, don't we? We start focusing on by saying, well, we gave direct funding to this organization in this place and they squandered it. I will tell you this. I believe from my experience, and this is just me speaking, okay? This is just Bob Mcpherson saying what he's seen and felt, is that a lot less money gets lost by direct funding to local NGOs as it does by funding through the national structures of some countries. So, and then again, there's no easy solution because, and I won't get into names, but there are countries out there that will not allow that direct funding. So it's a tough one, but it's doable.
Okay. Thank you. We're just about out of time. We're nearing the hour. I want to just put one more question to you, then I'd love to invite my colleague Jane, maybe if you want to come over here, Jane, we'll go to you to kind of do a very brief wrap up. But if you would, Bob, tell our listeners a little bit about the title. Why Stewards of Humanity, and what is stewardship to you in a humanitarian context?
Did you just think that up? Because that's a great question.
And I apologize, we didn't get to all the questions. There were some more good ones in the chat, but with limited time,
Okay.
that'd be a good one to end on.
For some of my NGO colleagues, you might roll your eyes now and go, uh-oh. The first time I became aware of the truest meanings of stewardship, believe it or not, was as a Marine. And they adopted that in their entire purpose and point was, you were stewards of the Marines you served with. And that, I never forgot that because it's even beyond leadership. It's greater than that. And it was not hard for me it just came to me. And in fact, to pull it out in a couple minutes left, the number of working titles I had for this book could make a book. I see my wife over there laughing. I mean, some of them were generally nut jobs, but it's interesting. The minute I fixed on that title, Stewards of Humanity, this book fell out in front of me. It just was there. So I hope that answered it.
Yeah, thank you. Bob, a huge thank you for joining us today. Jane, I'd love to just turn it to you to let people know where they can get the book, other resources that they might want to be aware of, and because you have a personal connection, maybe just another thank you to Bob.
Absolutely. Bob, thank you. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for the time you spent with us. And thank you most of all for taking the time and having the courage and the perseverance to bring this book to all of us, because it is what we need and we need it now. I think one of the things that we often say is we see it as kind of a humanitarian aid 101, but it's more than that. So we would all love to say thank you to this entire audience as well, and say that please, I don't know about you, but I could hear Bob tell these stories and talk to us for hours and hours. I definitely want more of this. So if you want more of this, I think you may. Please, Stewards of Humanity, you can purchase a hard copy wherever you buy books. If you happen to be in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Oh my goodness, Charlotte.
Sorry.
No.
Park Road Books is the place to go. Bob also has a website, and it actually, I was trying to figure out how to say this easily. It actually is his full name, robertseamusmcpherson.com, where you can hear more. Bob is also wonderfully working with many others to create, participate in podcasts in the next few months. So he'll be talking on the trauma therapists and Zen of dog ownership, and something called the Humanitarian. So stay tuned, stay in touch, and we will be as well. Global Washington very kindly will be posting a recorded version of this event, so you can share it with friends and watch it again. Thank you again, and thank you to Global Washington and to colleagues here. And thank you all. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all. We'll end the recording, and thank you all for joining.